welcome and good afternoon to the audience of the Angola Forum 2020 that join us from around the globe. Boam dia, boam tarde. The Angola Forum 2020 is hosted by Chatham House Africa program in cooperation with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I am pleased to have the honor to chair this session titled Green Growth and Building Back Better in Angola. Let me quickly introduce myself before I move on to the speakers. My name is Nathalie Russmann. I am the new incoming director of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Namibia and will take the office in January 2021. Currently, I am based in Berlin, preparing to move to Namibia soon. I have not become an expert to Angola yet, therefore very glad to have the opportunity to get introduced via Chatham House to this cycle and forum. As a political organization close to the CDU party, we support and promote democracy, peace, justice, rule of law, economic development, and sustainable growth. In February this year, Chancellor Angela Merkel held a visit to Angola. Angola is a pro-reform country in Africa. In this regard, and inspired by the Angola's ambition to reform, Germany focused to strengthen the economic cooperation between both countries. Also give support in different areas such as education and improvement of the living condition. Through partners such as Catholic University in Luanda and civil society organization, Konrad Adenauer Foundation Namibia also covers activities in Angola. With great hope, we recognize the structural transition and economic reform is on the way in Angola. In this context, this high-ranked virtual forum might be an opportunity to discuss the challenges and policy on the background of the COVID-19 pandemic. Options and steps that needs to be taken on the path to economic recovery and reform in Angola. Today, we will talk about economic reform and recovery in Angola. We will consider green growth potentials and take account for climate change and environmental sustainability. How to combine these requirements with the reforms, always bearing in mind that dependency solely on oil is no longer an option for Angola's development. Now I'm pleased to introduce our today's speakers. I will start with Mr. Giza Gaspar Martins. A very welcome to Mr. Giza Gaspar Martins. He is the Director of the Cabinet on Climate Change at the Ministry of Environment of the Republic of Angola. He was elected to chair the African Forum of Designated National Authorities and was selected as a co-chair of the Global Forum of National Authorities in 2011. In 2015, he chaired the least developed countries group in negotiation the Agreement on Climate Change in Paris. Mr. Gaspar Martins formerly served as Senior Advisor for Economic and Financial Affairs at the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Angola to the United Nations in New York, and he was a Senior Associate of Africa Global Partners in Washington, D.C. I also would like to invite and give a warm welcome to Mr. Vladimir Russo. Mr. Vladimir Russo serves as the Executive Director of the Fundação Kisama. I hope I pronounce it right. He's an environmental consultant with experience in the fields of environment, biodiversity, and environmental law. Mr. Vladimir Russo holds a master's and degree in environmental education from Broad University in South Africa. In the past, he was employed by UNEP and as National Director for Environment at the Ministry of Environment. In 2006, he was responsible for the development of Angola's first national biodiversity strategy and action plan. He's involved in a variety of conservation projects. And we are also glad to have Mr. Alan Kane in our forum today. Mr. Alan Kane is the founding director of the NGO Development Workshop. He is the project leader of the Development Workshop on the International Development Research Center and supports program on climate change, flooding and water supply in Angola's coastal cities. He has lived and worked in Angola since 1980, when Development Workshop was invited by the Angolan government to support its human settlements program. Mr. Kane was awarded an Order of Canada in 2004 for his work in international development, social housing, and contribution to peace building in Angola. He has worked as a consultant, led research projects for the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and United Nations, and also the European Union. He has been a visiting professor at the School for International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa. He's a member of the advisory board for the Environment and Urbanism Journal of the International Institute for Environment and Development. So we will have exciting and really good experts today. Before we get the input from our speakers, their presentations, please allow me to give some short technical instructions to all our attendees. You may already familiar with them, but I would like just to give some information. All attendees will be muted during the presentation, but you'll be able to raise your hand function during the Q&A session in order to ask a question live. If you are selected, be granted by the Africa program team the ability to unmute yourself and ask a question. Zoom participants may also submit written questions to the Q&A box throughout the meeting, throughout the presentation, but you can also raise your hand. Unfortunately, questions cannot be put via Facebook. We apologize for this. I also would like to remind that this meeting is on the record. And the last reminder is that filming is not allowed without prior permission given by the Chatham House. So far the introduction. I'm really eager to invite now our speakers, starting with Mr. Gisa Gaspar Martins to deliver his presentation, would say for maximum 7 to 10 minutes, and also kindly remind all our speakers to keep to time. Mr. Gaspar Martins, the floor is yours. We are excited to hear and to see your presentation. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Am I on? Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Very good. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Natalie. And I'd like to thank Chatham House for this invitation to participate in this in today's event. As it is indeed a timely event and one that in which we have the privilege of participating, and of course the capacity as Director of Environment and Climate Action for the Ministry of Culture, Tourism and Environment now it is. Given that I have 7 minutes, I decided to focus my presentation on climate change, which is the area for which I am directly responsible for. Climate change is for us the greatest challenge facing humanity, and one that here in Angola we do not find ourselves immune to. It is, of course, a phenomenon that is caused by increasing concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and for countries like Angola, we are, of course, not historically responsible for them, but consider ourselves equally responsible to deal with its impacts. As a result of this challenge in Angola, we have, among other measures, devised a national climate change strategy. that is in the process of being adopted. Its main objective is really to mainstream climate considerations into the sectors that constitute the economic and social fabric of our society. In other words, to include climate considerations into decisions that are made for economic and social investment with a view to ensuring their sustainability. The advent of the COVID pandemic has, in many ways, afforded us the opportunity to reset a lot of our processes, has unleashed a process of budget revisions and priority um, um, realignment, which is in many ways affording us once again the opportunity to revisit some of the decisions that had been made and replan, retool. And in that sense, we are happy that climate change is indeed being considered in many initiatives. I have unfortunately a presentation in Portuguese, but we'll try to highlight most of it in English as well. So Angola is a vast country with a long coastal area, apparently 1,650 kilometers of coastal areas, a climate that is considered a tropical climate. We have some evidence of an evolving change in the behavior of some climate parameters in Angola, including, of course, temperature, which is expected to increase by some 1.5 degrees by the turn of the century, as well as a potential decrease in precipitation by up to 2 millimeters per month towards the end of but by the turn of the century. The national strategy for climate change aims to really integrate tools, give us the tools to, of course, implement the Paris Agreement on climate change, one that Angola officially ratified on Thursday. Of course, establish the roads for embarking, for adopting low carbon development in Angola, adopting our society to those effects of climate change that we can no longer avoid through lowering of emissions, and as well, of course, to mainstream, as stated earlier, climate considerations into various sectorial policies. Its mission is to have an Angola adapted to the impacts of climate change, that contributes in a way that contributes to low carbon development, and as well that contributes to poverty eradication. Um, the strategy has 5 main pillars. One is, of course, mitigation, that is reduction of emissions. Second, adaptation, that is adapting to the effects that we can no longer avoid. Of course, institutional capacity building and transfers technology. Fourth pillar is financing climate action in Angola. And of course, a fifth pillar is research and systematic analysis of observed climate parameters, so the behavioral climate parameters. Within each pillar, there are a set of actions, a set of areas of action that have been identified, and within each of them, there are goals and targets that should be achieved. In the area of mitigation, so emission reduction, embarking on low carbon development, energy, agriculture, forest and land use, industry and waste management are the focus areas. Whereas in adaptation, agriculture and fisheries, coastal areas, forests, ecosystems and biodiversity, as well as water resources are the areas of focus. Given that we only have 7 minutes, I will not dwell on each of the identified strains of action, but as an example, for instance, we have as one of the actions that needs to take place within the mitigation pillar is, for instance, the production of low carbon energy, as well as access to low carbon energy in the rural areas. The sorts of activities that are envisaged are those that will harness Angola's natural potential. In the case of renewable energy, in particular, it is profound and well documented, both in terms of solar energy, wind, as well as hydro resources. Um, Other actions include energy efficiency, reductions of fugitive emissions resulting from the oil industry, excuse me, forest management, efficiency, energy efficiency within industry, and of course, waste management. For adaptation, of course, sustainable agriculture or climate smart agriculture, as it's now called, it is one of our focal areas. Um, Again, for each of these areas, we have identified specific actions and targets that we aim to promote and achieve. Capacity, both institutional as well as human capacity, are of course another area of focus in our strategy. A fourth area of importance in a strategy is, of course, our research and systematic observation and research, really, which go to one of the themes of this event, which is the use of data, reliable data, for the purposes of policy formulation. In this area, as it relates to climate change, we endeavor to, in particular, expand our network of observation stations so that we are able to have documented data on the behavioral climate parameters, as well as how they, and then of course through analysis, how are they affecting our economic and social life, in essence, in the country. And that constitutes a particular pillar of action within our strategy. The outcome of those analysis, of those for first observation, then analysis, is of course to feed into the policy making process. It is believed that through proper data, actual data, well analyzed, we will be able to formulate the policies that will enable sustainability in the country. Among other tools that the strategy sets out is, of course, our national MRV system, which is envisaged to cover both inventories, mitigation actions, as well as, of course, adaptation and financial flows. We also need to understand what level of resources are flowing, both national resources and resources that can be mobilized internationally, are flowing towards climate action, and within climate action, what's flowing towards mitigation and what's flowing through adaptation. And so our national MRV system envisaged within the strategy aims to keep track of also financial flows. The strategy recognizes that there is a universe of actors that enable sustainability or climate action. Among them are, of course, the public institutions, but as well academic and research institutions, civil society, financial institutions, universities, etc., etc. So this is our draft strategy. In closing, I'd like to just take 1 minute or so to state that COVID, as again, as stated earlier, afforded us the opportunity to revisit our development process, decisions aiming at development. Angola's constitution is one that considers the right to a healthy environment a fundamental right. Thereby, we consider and are undertaking the steps that will firstly provide us with the data that is necessary to devise appropriate policies, including, of course, as they relate to safeguarding the environment and ensuring that economic activity takes due account for environmental impacts, as well as the long-term sustainability and viability of our communities and society. Thank you very much.
Mr. Gaspar Martin, thank you very much for your presentation. You've given us an inside view of the targets and challenges implementing the Paris Climate Agreement. Thank you very much. I would like to invite the audience to put their questions to the F&A box. While we now move on with our next speaker, that is Mr. Vladimir Russo. Again, very welcome, Mr. Vladimir Russo. We are delighted to join your presentation. The floor is yours. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. I trust you can see my presentation now.
Yeah, I can see the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be talking a little bit about the importance of the Angola National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, NBSAP for short. This is a document that arises from the Convention on Biological Diversity, and to which Angola has developed now the second NBSAP. The first one was developed in 2006, and it was planned to have a duration of 6 years up to 2012. But of course, due to many aspects, it wasn't able to be implemented fully until last year, where the government has approved a second national biodiversity strategy and an action plan. And I think what's important to highlight, although it's a policy and an action document, it recognizes the rich biodiversity features in Angola. As you can see here, we have a number of important biomes and ecoregions. We have 7 out of 9 biomes that we have in Africa. So it's a quite rich country, rich, diverse, and full of endemism. We have 15 of the WWF ecoregions, and Angola is considered the second most biodiverse country in Africa after South Africa. So it's really a huge and diverse country, and a group of authors and people working, researchers, were able to put together this Biodiversity of Angola book that provides a modern synthesis of all the most important key features, key biodiversity features in Angola, ranging from the rainforest in Cabinda province to the desert in the Namib province. So recognizing the importance of biodiversity, a number of documents have been published. Some first looking at framing the biodiversity in terms of how we should protect. So the first kind of document that mentions biodiversity is our environmental framework law that was approved in 1998. And from 1998 to now, we should have around 50 documents that consider biodiversity as cross-cutting issue and an important aspects of biodiversity in Angola. Then this NBSAP 2019-2025 was approved. The vision is really that by 2025, the Angolan biodiversity should be valued. So you should put an economic and a social value into our biodiversity, should be restored, particularly the areas where we have environmental degradation, and it should be maintained, particularly in terms of the provision of the ecosystem services. As Jesus mentioned in our constitution, the right of living a healthy and unpolluted environment is a fundamental right, and this is also encapsulated in the vision of the NBSAP. And lastly, the vision is that all those resources should be shared and benefit all people. So this issue of people separate from parts is now being more unified. The objective, is really to take some effective measures. As you can see, I've listed here some of the sustainable development goals that are quite strictly linked to the national, to NBSAP. And this NBSAP brings 12 strategic goals. And the strategic goals are divided in a number of aspects. For example, the reduction of pressure on biodiversity. There is lots of pressure on natural resources for human livelihoods, for human consumption, for human survival in some cases, but in other cases for commercial purposes. There is a need to strengthen our conservation areas network. We inherited from the colonial period a number of protected areas that were equivalent to 6.6% of the Angolan territory. And since 2011, we almost doubled it. So now it's around 13%, but still far from the IG targets. And the NBSAP is providing room and space for us to be able to meet those targets. Of course, promoting research. There is lots of things to be researched in Angola, and I'll show you in the next slide a little bit on those aspects. Increasing the environmental awareness activities. When the environmental law was approved in 1998, the Angolan population was just below 10 million. We are now close to 30 million people, so there is more environmental awareness that is required. Implementing the multilateral environmental agreements like Convention on Biological Diversity, on climate change, desertification, etc. Another aspect is to strengthen the role of the communities, particularly as part of community-based natural resource management or community-based conservation, because in the past people have been seeing as separate from conservation. So this NBSAP brings that important role of communities in managing the resources, restoring biodiversity, of course, legislation development and enforcement. We have recently seen a law, the environmental conservation law was approved last April, and it was an important law because it revokes legislation that was developed in colonial times. So we have now a brand new legislation for conservation areas, and of course the need for law enforcement and monitoring NBSAP and restoring degraded ecosystem. So the NBSAP as a whole has more than 100 national actions, so items, recommendations for activities that are to be undertaken nationally, and more than 200 provincial actions. So provincial actions, we are divided into 18 provinces, and the strategy provides recommendations for specific actions for each of the 18 provinces in Angola. So it's an important document that looks at what was done since the first NBSAP in 2006 and projects the future for the next 5 years. One of the aspects that is really important has been putting Angola on the top of the world is a resurgence haven. So if you look at this image developed by GBIF, you can see Angola. This is the area where you see most black shadows there. So it means that there is lots of research that needs still to be undertaken compared to other parts in other regions of Africa, particularly Southern Africa. So there is many species to be discovered, to be described, to be protected, particularly in terms of reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and the plant life. We have between 5,000 to 8,000 plant species. So there's lots of research that need to be done, not only for protection of the species, but also to be used for medicinal purposes, cultural purposes, etc. The book that I mentioned earlier is the same that you see here. So this book was published in English and Portuguese, and it's freely available on the internet, so you can download it free of charge. It highlights a number of specific needs for the country, like, for example, vegetation maps, socioeconomic surveys in terms of the conservation areas, because the conservation areas were established and then people moved in, and in some cases people were already there. So there is need to undertake a little bit more of a socioeconomic surveys to see how people and parks can live together. The expansion of biodiversity baseline, a species list, a special distribution to be able to understand better how the species are distributed. We know that they are in Angola, but how they are distributed within the different ecozones, the different biomes, and the new law requests for a zoning and reclassification of all the protected areas. So it's really important that all the protected areas that we have now are reclassified, and zoning is proposed based on the new legislation. Also requires or recommends the planning tools for the use of and management of natural resources. So in a way that we will do a sustainable development, a proper and adequate sustainable development of our resources, and also start looking at approaches to community-based natural resource management. Some of the new laws, for example, laws related to forest products, allow people to start using for their own benefit. So it's becoming clear in many of the laws being passed recently, the need to have people managing those resources. And of course, the development of a national portal. We do have lots of information that is spread all over the place. Some of the information is not published. So it's important really to start having a central way, central place where information could be stored and used for decision making, for research purposes, for training purposes, etc. So in terms of, I think, to end off this presentation, maybe to talk a little bit about the potential partnerships. We've been seeing the past 5 years a number of international institutions wanting to come to Angola to help Angola, either in terms of establishing environmental conservation areas, particularly in terms of new areas to cover new biomes, new areas that have not been covered before. We are in the process now of establishing the first marine protected area. It's planned to be established by 2022, 2023. The first marine protected area. 3 new terrestrial protected areas are also being planned. So there's lots of room to help in the process of establishment, but also in terms of the management of such conservation areas. And we have a very recent example of the Iona National Park, which will be managed in a different framework with the African parks, and there is negotiations with other institutions to help us to manage other parks, and including aspects of climate change that Giza has mentioned. So we are trying to bridge conservation of biodiversity with climate change. Conservation of flagship species as well. We've got many flagship species in Angola. I think the most iconic one is the giant sable, endemic species to Angola that only exists in the heart of Angola in the Malange province, and we are down to 250 individuals. So it's a endangered species. So there's lots of room also for projects on those areas. And as I mentioned in my earlier slide, in terms of research, it's really important that such partnerships are aligned in terms of research, but also in terms of implementation, are aligned with the National Biodiversity Strategy. Of course, some of the international objectives and goals like the Aichi targets and Sustainable Development Goals. We do have commitments that Angola has made by signing and ratifying different agreements, including the latest one that was the Paris Agreement that was signed in November 16, but also guidelines from different other institutions. And an important aspect also for us to be able to implement the recommendations from the National Biodiversity Strategy are definitely related to capacity building and training of young Angolan researchers and students. And all of these, we did the frame of the 5 Ps that are part of the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is really lots of important aspects in Angolan biodiversity, as indicated, lots of key features, lots of important species, lots of aspects to discuss and to discover and to report and to protect. And this is only possible if we have a framework, which we have, NBSAP, but also lots of people and organizations willing to help us, Angola, to protect its own biodiversity. I thank you. Natalie, your mic is off.
Mr. Vladimir Russo, thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and your specific experience on this field, on biodiversity. I think we are quite impressed what steps has already been taken in Angola regarding the climate change and finding alternative resources. I think we will get back to that issue later on with our questions. And again, I would like to motivate or provoke questions to the audience. Regarding the time, we would like to move on to our next expert, that is Mr. Alan Kane, who also prepared a presentation. And the floor is yours, Mr. Alan Kane. I'm delighted to open your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. I'm just going to share my screen here. Yes, thanks. Thanks also to Adenauer Foundation and Chatham House for the opportunity to participate in this this workshop. I'm going to talk about climate change from an urban point of view, and Angola is a highly urbanized country with basically 2/3 of the population living in cities. And a large proportion of these people live in coastal cities that are affected by climate change and related problems. This project was developed basically with the aim of improving knowledge about climate change, hydrology related to coastal settlement areas, where roughly 12 million of Angola's population lives. And we focused on 4 of the major urban settlements or urban areas in coastal Angola. And with the objective of developing tools for adaptation planning, particularly in urban areas. During the many years of conflict in Angola, there was a major shift of populations from the central highlands of Angola to the relative safety of coastal cities, where populations who were displaced tended to find refuge in the crowded shanty towns called museks in these cities, and occupied some of the cheapest land that they could afford procuring, or and much of this land was vulnerable, flood prone, and environmentally risky areas where people built their homes in stages progressively over time. This is a map of the coastal areas that we were focusing on. And just to note that basically 2/3 of Angola's urban population lives in these areas, and they're suffering the effects of having many of the poorest having been displaced and occupying land that is vulnerable, but also encountering areas with inadequate water supply and inadequate housing in some of the most vulnerable spots in the coastal areas. This is an interesting graphic that shows on the vertical axis index of poverty versus deaths related, mortality related to environmental causes. And we can see that Angola is internationally in the group of most seriously affected countries when measured against these matrices. Now, one of the major concerns, and GISA talked about the development of Angola's research capacity in dealing with climate change or climate data, but we can see that climate information began to be collected in the 1930s by the colonial regime, and at the end of the colonial period had a fairly ample distribution of climatic meteorological stations across the country. But in the post-war years had really had a little more, almost the same number of active climate change climate stations as in the beginning of the colonial era of building climatic stations. Now, GISA talked about the recent programs of the government to extend the network of meteorological and hydraulic stations, and that's important, but it's also important for climatic modeling. One needs at least a 10-year sequential record of climate data to be able to be useful in climatic modeling. So we're still confronted with a major lack of data. In the research project that we were engaged with support from IDRC, lacking climatic data, we looked for alternative forms of information, and one of them that Development Workshop has put together in over the last 20 years is a media monitoring service. And one of the things that we do monitor are climatic or storms or climatic impacts. And some of this data, although it's not scientific meteorological data, media reports contain information that meteorological stations wouldn't collect in terms of the human impact of climate events. So we're able to build as an alternative analysis of the impact of climate on and climate change through media monitoring as a supplementary source of information. The project also digitalized historic data from archive data. We searched archives in UK and Portugal and of course in Angola, and put together really an analysis of this little graphic represents storm events. And we can see that there's over the years, over the last almost a century, we can see that the incidence of climatic events, particularly flooding and storms, is increasing on a regular basis. And the map on the right-hand side is a mapping of climatic variation. So it picks up areas where, and we know that climate change has produced drier droughts and more severe floods and storms. And this map captures that information about climatic variation. The research project also built a network of participatory engagement of communities and university students and local government authorities and village elders and urban elders in gathering and mapping information in a participatory way, and using a participatory geographic information system to build maps and use remote sensing for digital monitoring of the impact of climate change on urban settlements, and capturing the memories of particularly elders in the community about events that possibly were not recorded, but recorded in people's memories. We were able to build, using remote sensing, demographic models of density, and projected on this data that we, in these 4 cities that we were able to put together, on environmental impacts, on environmental risks. I won't go into the detail, but it includes erosion and flooding and stagnant water. This data allowed us to build in the 4 cities that we worked on risk maps that were aimed at for the use of physical planners and municipalities in these 4 cities to provide information on points of environmental risk and data in a graphic form that could be used by physical and municipal planners in planning their local interventions in the various cities. We also engaged the communities that were involved in the co-participation, the co-production of the data, and by engaging communities in participatory actions in their own settlements, informal settlements, around prevention of construction in high-risk flood-prone basins, and the promotion of the protection of drainage courses to prevent the rapid runoff of rainstorms. This is this last slide covers work that we've been engaged with this year in an emergency action against COVID, the COVID pandemic. And we're using these same networks of community associations, particularly ones engaged in management of water supply and in the and water points in the high density slums, Museks, in a number of the major cities and provincial towns in Angola. And DW has supported community water committees and trained water managers in these peri-urban neighborhoods. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, these community water managers have been key frontline workers and in promoting hygiene, distribution of safety information and equipment that to the communities that they're engaged with around coronavirus. But this activity in the communities is also a high risk activity, and we've been supporting them with equipment and gloves and masks, etc., and training information. In conclusion, we can see that the low-lying African coastal cities, and particularly in Angola, disproportionately suffer environmental risks due to climate change. And the kinds of risks that Giza mentioned in terms of rising water levels, but also the increase of tropical storms in coastal areas. The data is still insufficient in, particularly in post-conflict countries like Angola, and I should say Mozambique as well, to be able to provide accurate data for modeling. And Vladimir's map showing the lack of research information on Angola is an example of this, I think. Urban planners in Angola must incorporate climatic change adaptation considerations as part of their urban planning strategies. And the kinds of risk maps that we're able to produce are essential for urban planning. But in order to reduce vulnerability, communities themselves can and must be involved in promoting micro-level projects. Vladimir talked about local actions, community actions that are important in urban as well as rural areas to develop adaptation plans and resilience to climate change, but also the associated disasters and floods and storms that we find in coastal areas. So thanks very much. I'll end here.
Mr. Alan Kane, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it gives us a really inside view of your work in the community, especially the pictures. I really like them. It makes it a bit vivid and clear. I also appreciate that beside the policies and strategies been pointing out about our speakers before, we also talked about the practical problems like collecting data and the lack of data, and the necessity of having reliable data before before modeling or before setting up a plan. I appreciate it very much. I think we will have enough or a lot of input, interesting input for our next session, which will be the discussion. But before I open the discussion, I will, for a quick view, introduce another panelist, which is Mr. Pedro Martins Barata. He holds a Master in Economics. He's an international expert with 22 years of experience in international climate policy and carbon markets, having assisted in the negotiations on the development of the Kyoto carbon market mechanism since 1999. From 2008 to 2011, Pedro was member of the executive board of the CDM to the Kyoto Protocol, and in 2010, he was elected its vice chair. Additionally, from 2008 to 2011, Pedro was a senior policy advisor for the Interministerial Climate Change Commission of the Portuguese Ministry of Environment. He has advised governments on international climate negotiations on carbon markets. In Angola, Mr. Martins Barata was recently part of the consortium team involved in the preparation of Angola's long-term strategy 2050, leading the environment and sustainability chapter. So I'm really glad that we could take Mr. Martins Barata into our discussion. I'm glad that he could join us. Thank you very much for that. Good. So we are already running out a bit of time, and we will move on to the next chapter, which is the questions and answering. So, and we will start with the first question. I think the first question will be to Mr. Martins. Mr. Martins, from our audience, we got the question, what is Angola's plan for phasing out to the oil industry and finding alternative energy sources for domestic consumption, concretely hydropower, solar, and wind? Do you have any ideas about that or any contribution to that question that you can maybe bring into this discussion about phasing out the oil industry and finding alternative energy sources for domestic consumption, concretely hydropower, solar and wind. So please, we would like to hear your contribution to that question.
Thank you, Natalie. That's a difficult one.
Yeah.
But one that also, most have an answer. Angola has been since the beginning of the oil industry in Angola, really a net exporter of oil and its derivatives. Now we import byproducts, but we're mostly an exporter of oil. So oil is an important source of revenue for the country, for the economy. The dependency on oil is an issue that has been identified and has been flagged for a number of years now. And as a result, Angola has embarked in an economic diversification program that really involves diversifying the sources of income and stimulating activities in other sectors other than oil. With regard, so having said that, Angola's energy consumption is mostly derived from not fossil fuels. There is, in the last few years, a number of investments have come online, such as the La Huca hydro dam, which is a large 700 megawatt power station, and there are others planned. There are projects underway, and there have been some already implemented that turn fossil fuel-based power, electricity producing units within, in particular, provincial cities into hybrid systems that include solar energy. So harnessing the sun when possible, and only if necessary switch to fossil fuels. And there are a number of other investments planned, particularly for the energy sector, that really aim to harness the renewable potential that Angola has. For that, I would reference people to a website that has material in English as well, which is Angola Energy 2025. Angola Energy 2025, I think .org or .com, one or the other. But within that page, you will find what are planned investments in the energy sector through 2025. As the new long-term development strategy is released, I assume that there will be an effort to update that information, to extend it to 2050. But so the short answer is there are a number of programs and investments that are being realized in the energy sector that will enable Angola to harness its renewable potential. Angola is naturally a renewable energy, is well endowed and potentially an energy exporter in the region. And so that is not an issue. Oil is basically an export commodity. To what extent will that export commodity remain so? I think it's a function of what the world is demanding, and lesser so a function of what we are consuming, because we consume very little of it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for answering this question. Maybe I can add another aspect or another question in that context. It comes from an audience. Is there a cost identified to deliver the climate change tragedy, and will resources be mobilized to complete it? Maybe you have any idea about this?
Okay, so we don't. We have not costed out all the initiatives contained within the strategy. Frankly, it would be a difficult and long process. What it does, though, what the strategy does, it identifies priorities. If you'd like, it identifies the low-hanging fruit in both mitigation, low-hanging fruit, and in adaptation, the urgent activities that need to be realized. We have not endeavored to cost them, but in countries like Angola, development decisions are being made every day. What we aim with the strategy is to include in those decisions climate considerations. And in some cases, we are being successful. And that's in essence the aim of the strategy. It is to mainstream climate considerations in decision-making processes about development. Decisions about investments that will be with us for the next 30, 40 years are being taken today. And it is to our advantage that those take into consideration climate considerations. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I may, Natalie, just to...
Yeah, sure. Just step in.
Thank you. Just to quickly add in, so I was involved in assisting with the long-term strategy, the environment chapter of the long-term strategy for Angola in 2050. And one of the things that I have to say regarding this question is that there from the start, there was the message that was given to myself as a consultant was, we fully recognize that Angola is in a process of weaning itself out of the extreme dependency it has on oil revenues, and it's not because of any surge in environmentalism. It's just the sheer reality of the fact that one, the oil market, international oil market is changing very quickly. Two, the resources in Angola are not necessarily going to be amongst the most competitive, and that puts stress. But as Giso, I think, was implying as well, it puts a lot of opportunities in terms of providing space for the development of other types of energy streams. So we need to, or say the Angolans should in fact open up the opportunity now to develop renewables in this transition phase to let's say a fully renewable energy system. And so the actual data on what is the expected, for instance, carbon emissions of Angola from the energy sector is quite interesting, because there is an expectation that they will drop significantly over the next, I would say, 15 to 20 years, just to give an idea.
Thank you. Thank you so much for pointing out these issues. I will pick up the next questions. I think this will go to Mr. Vladimir Russo. You have mentioned that the richness and the diversity of the country, that Angola is a huge and diverse country, and also introduced the biodiversity plan. And the question is, what measures have you put to ensure, or been put so far, to ensure that the state remains focused on the plan? Do you have any idea on that? Is it still, or is it just a plan, or are there already measures been taken or activities been done coming out from this plan? So this, maybe you have got some ideas.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, now please note that this is the second plan in terms of the NBSAP. The first one, as I said, was established in 2006, and many projects have been implemented based on the recommendations of the plan. So we do have lots of good examples and good projects that can show some progress in terms of conservation of our biodiversity. I mean, two examples. One will be for the giant sable project. As indicated, is an endemic species to Angola, and when we started working in the Cangandala National Park in Malange province, there were none individuals. There were some crossbreeding there, but no hybrids. There were no natural giant sable there. So we had to bring from another park, from Luando. So in 2009, we brought 9 animals. And now in 2020, we have close to 100. So it has an increase in terms of breeding that specific population there. And we've seen also an increase on the population in the Luando Nature Reserve, that when we started doing inventories there back in 2011, we had close to 70 animals, 70, 80 animals. Now we have close to 140. So there's a huge increase in terms of that particular species. On the marine turtles, for example, we have a project, a long-lasting project that started in 2003, and to date we've released more than 3.5 million marine turtles to sea. So we do have some indicators on some of the species. In terms of establishing new protected areas, as I said, we've doubled in 2011 with establishment of 3 new protected areas. So there are some examples. We have more recently, in the past 2 years, a project on the restoring of the mangroves, and more than 1,000 hectares have been restored along the Angolan coast. So it's not just a plan. There are some activities, some done by the civil society, some done by government. We've doubled the number of game rangers in country, for example, and there is training ongoing. There is new 250 game rangers that will join the conservation areas network in the near future. But of course, we suffer a lot from issues related to lack of funding. You know, the budget, the annual budget for Ministry of Environment, and Mr. Giza can speak about that, but it's very limited. So we are very dependent on GF funding, for example, or any other donor funding. And particularly now during this COVID pandemic, it's been very hard to be able to secure funding for some of the projects, particularly when it comes to paying salaries to game rangers. It's quite difficult to get those funds. But yeah, there are good examples. And Angola submits regularly to the Convention of Biological Diversity its national biodiversity report, where some of those progresses have been reported.
Okay, thank you very much. We have really a lot of questions. Thank you so far. I tried to collect them and to summarize them a bit. Yeah, the next question, maybe again to Mr. Giza Gaspar Martins. It's from Pedro Martins Barata, who just joined us. Yeah, it's about, or it touches again the problematic of a decrease of oil prices and decline of oil revenues. It's now recognized that oil revenues will fall and that the new development model is required for Angola. Well, in that challenging environment, Angola is potentially graduating from LDC status. How do you think the Angolan position will be impacted, and how would common but differentiated responsibilities function in Angola? Which means, which responsibilities could Angola take it, and on the basis of what kind of support? Maybe you can give us some information or some answer to that question. Mr.
Okay, very good. Yeah, sorry. I think this is when this is where today's session begins to resemble yesterday's session on economic reform, and it is, these are issues that we've alluded to, including Mr. Pedro today. We find ourselves at a moment as a country wherein there is a recognized need to transform our economy. And in that sense, we have the opportunity to transform it in a way that is sustainable, that takes in, or that recognizes the 3 pillars of sustainable development, of sustainability. With regards to oil revenues in particular, we are in many ways already experiencing the impact of declining oil revenues as a result of the crisis, of the COVID crisis that the world is experiencing. There has been an impact on the price of oil. Oil prices have steadily decreased since its highs of 2 years ago. And in addition, we find ourselves in a position wherein our existing fields are also depleting in terms of production, and there have not been new investments. Therefore, our production is equally decreasing. So we are receiving less revenue from oil, both due to lower prices, but also due to declining production. And we are endeavoring to reinvent ourselves, to transform our economy, to make greater investments and incentivize investments in other sectors such as agriculture. Having said this, and particularly because common but differentiated responsibilities were referenced, when it comes to climate change, we must also recognize that our responsibility vis-a-vis the decisions that have to be made in order to contribute towards preserving the global climate system for the entire world, not just for Angolans, need to be implemented in an enabling environment at the international level. There are technologies and resources which need to be made available, so means of implementation which need to be made available to countries like Angola so that the correct choices are viable, that also need to happen. So in other words, our decisions today have a lot to do with reforming and transforming our own economy, but also have to do with the prevalence of an enabling environment at the international level. I hope I began to address it. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got another interesting question here in my box. I would address this maybe to Mr. Alan Kane. The question is about the impact of, or the effects in the Arctic region. Do we consider, or how do we consider the climate change effects in the Arctic region will affect Africa in general and in Angola in particular? How and what can be done? Maybe I can widen this question a bit. For so far, we are just talking about Angola and the climate change and strategies plan and so far. Do we, or can we also see Angola kind of example for other nations in Africa, or to widen this discussion a bit outside Angola, maybe to point out that if Angola is doing well in finding environmental solutions or other resources, what about the neighboring countries? Do we have to engage them? And are there strategies to look at, knowing that climate issues is not a one country problem, but we must see it on a regional way, and yeah, maybe we can put these questions together, the influence of the Arctic region, and also to widen the discussion a bit outside Angola, to look at the neighboring countries such as the DRC or even Namibia or any other neighboring countries. Yeah, I would give Mr. Alan Kane probably to give us an idea or an answer to this question, but also invite the other speakers to participate. Thank you.
Yes, Natalie, I think what you're talking about is the impact of global climate change. I mean, the rising sea levels, and but I think we can see with examples from all over the world, and particularly in Africa, but also in Asia and America. Every year we are suffering greater climatic crises, storms. On the other hand, droughts. When we look at the Southern Africa region, we are coming out of a cycle of serious droughts that have affected not only Southern Angola but also Namibia and Botswana. I mean, all of the neighboring countries. And as I showed you in the slide, the severity of climatic events, we can map that historically, and we can see that year by year, at least decade by decade, it's possible to see quite clearly the increase in severity of these climatic events. So, I mean, I think effectively that's what we're talking about. And also, I mean, I think internationally, but also very much in Africa, populations live in these coastal areas. The majority of Angolan populations we can see from my presentation, but if we look at Mozambique, for example, most of the major settlement areas are cities in coastal areas that have been really severely affected by the increase of the violence of tropical storms in throughout the African region. So, I mean, there's a combination of naturally evolving climatic changes, but also the changes that are provoked by human settlements themselves. The concentration of people in areas where natural bush or forest cover is denuded, and particularly in the river basins that collect water from coastal rainstorms and channel that floodwater down to coastal urban settlements. I mean, here in Benguela, coastal settlements, particularly in Benguela province, but also in Luanda, have suffered severely in the last decade or so. I mean, we have serious crisis situations, and this needs to be managed by a combination of action of urban planning, of land management, land use management, but also community action in mitigation activities around climatic adaptation of settlements. I mean, climate change is not just a natural phenomena. It's a human settlements phenomena that has resulted in impact on some of the most vulnerable and poorest communities in Angola and in many other neighboring countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so far. Maybe I add another question or bring another question to our discussion. Talking about oil companies, and would be the question maybe, what role does the panel see, or that you see, for international oil companies to support climate change mitigation? Where shall we focus on? How about carbon offsetting, like supporting diversity protection in different areas? So the question is, what will be the role of the international oil companies in this context and climate change? Do they play a role, or do they will adapt their views? What is your ideas or your answer to this question, maybe? I don't know whom to address this question. Well, I'll just, maybe Mr. Alan Kane, you can give us some answer to that.
Well, I think one of the things that international oil companies have been obliged to do in Angola is invest in the capture of gas. I mean, the Soyo liquefied natural gas plant was really an imposition, I mean, a demand of the Angolan government to stop the flaring and from gas from the oil fields and turn it into a resource that could be used for industrial promotion in the region. So, I mean, I think that's I think the oil companies maybe eventually saw this as an opportunity, but it was very much the state that I think imposed the need to stop the waste of natural gas and the flaring of natural gas. And as a consortium of oil companies, including the state oil company that are engaged in that liquefied natural gas plant, that I'm not sure is actually functioning yet, but long delayed, but maybe, well, basically transforming a problem into a resource.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe if I can add here, yes, I mean, there is some, this is an example trying to capture the gas that was usually burned into flash. So it can feed into a LNG plant. There is a second LNG plant being also prepared that is going to be able to feed into the national grid in terms of power generation. So it's another aspect, trying to clean our power energy matrix from fossil fuels to hydro power and other projects. So there's also a couple of these companies investing in solar projects. So there's a joint venture now between two companies trying to start a 100 megawatt solar PV park in south of Angola. And some of them also, as part of their project, they've been supporting biodiversity projects, either through biodiversity conservation projects to reforestation projects. There is an investment. I don't think it's still enough. I think it, they could do more. But of course, it's not only support the biodiversity sector, but also health and education sector. But yeah, there is still room for improvement. But moving from fossil fuels into more cleaner energy will definitely provide more space and more room for those companies that have technical skills and R&D departments to be able to support Angola in this transition period.
Natalie, if I may.
Yes, sure. Just step in.
I think that the world has embarked in an irreversible path towards decarbonizing its economies. And oil companies are ones that have taken this cue some time ago. There are some companies that are already transforming themselves from oil companies to energy companies. To us here in Angola, I think the challenge is to also take this cue and incorporate this cue in the economic transformation that we are attempting to do here in Angola. As stated earlier, this is not a country that is a high consumer of fossil fuels. We are a country that is an exporter. We are dependent, yes, on fossil fuels, on oil mostly, because it is a source of income. As we transform our economy, as we diversify our economy, certainly we will be less dependent upon that revenue. And certainly oil companies, as they have done so elsewhere, will also transform themselves if they indeed will remain players in Angola's economy, which I'm sure they will. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to mention as well that oil companies, a number of their social programs are invested in climate change focused projects and engaging local communities, and companies like BP and Chevron, etc., are using their social programs to supplement some of the government resources, particularly in community action around climate change. So that's worth mentioning, and certainly appreciated.
Yeah, it's good that we have been also talking about the role of the oil companies. I think this is an important thing to point out. I've got another very specific question, maybe to Mr. Martins or even Mr. Martins Barata, who is an expert in carbon development. The question is, are you confident that the construction of a new oil refinery, there seems to be a new one in Angola, is consistent with the country's plans to prepare for a lower carbon future? I haven't known anything about a new oil refinery, but you are all much more familiar than me. So the question is, is this a contradiction, or how can we explain this? That there'll be construction of new oil refineries on the one hand, on the other hand, the need or the plan to lower carbon future development. So how this goes together?
I can attempt a simple answer to that. The answer is essentially that, as with many other countries, there is difficulties in policy coordination. So I have only to take, and I'm sorry to do it, but I have only to take, for instance, Germany as an example of a country that is highly committed to the Energiewende, so the energy transformation, and yet has very recently also allowed for the construction of a coal-fired power plant. These things happen. There are different parts of government with different agendas. That's understandable. And having said that, I do think that a bit with the way that Mr. Giza Gaspar Martins mentioned, I think it's irreversible, this trend. And I think that investments, large-scale investments, especially if we're talking about public investments or publicly supported investments in things like oil refining these days, will have to be really carefully looked at, because you really do run the risk of having stranded assets. Stranded assets, just information, is assets that you will have spent money on, but you will never be able to take the revenue from, simply because there won't be any oil economy in the time, like the lifetime necessary to recoup the investment. So I won't say that I won't flourish it. I think it is potentially quite a mistake. But having said that, it's understandable, and like I said, it's not a developing world problem. It's a generic governance problem, and you find it in across different geographies.
Mm-hmm.
Pedro, but I'll add a little bit, and
Yes.
it will not be to contradict completely Pedro. It will just serve to add a little bit of context. Angola spends approximately $2 billion a year importing oil byproducts to sustain a demand that's not served by local currency. So often by local production. So we do not have sufficient installed refining capacity in Angola to sustain our own needs, and as a result, our demand is covered by the import of oil refined products, or some at least, and particularly gasoline and diesel. So it's a very difficult proposition for planners to see that we have the opportunity to save from hard currency that could be devoted to other investments by not doing investments that will, in essence, cover that demand for hard currency. So to follow on from what Pedro has stated, I mean, there is even at the best of circumstances in terms of policy coordination, there are difficulties sometimes in reconciling objectives. And this is one instance in which perhaps the decision did not fall on the side of the most optimist of a climate warrior would have desired to for it to lay on. But as a result of a short to medium term necessity. In other words, it was necessary to ensure that $1 to $2 billion a year were available in a short to medium term to enable investments, as opposed to purchasing a commodity that or products that could be produced locally. Having said this, I mean, fossil fuels will not, in the medium term, disappear from our economies. Their efficiency, the efficiency in their use will certainly increase. There is sufficient pressure on the uses of fossil fuels for its efficiency to improve significantly. There are activities that will use, of course, less and less of fossil fuels. Certainly in transportation and in other sectors, this is visible at this point. That in the medium term, in 5 to 10 years, perhaps the internal combustion engine for transportation will be a thing of the past. But there are other uses for fossil fuels, and while these technologies are not widely available, in particular in places like Angola, there will still be a use for a refinery, and there will still be the opportunity to save $1 to $2 billion a year in imports of byproducts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt you now because we are running out of time. Somehow it's really going fast. I wish we could carry on this discussion, and it's really getting more and more interesting. We have taken many aspects into the topic, economic recovery and reform in Angola, especially pointing out the environmental issues, climate change, and the impact on its economy. Before handing over to Mr. Alex Wines, who will give us a concluding remark, let me conclude myself in the name of Konrad Adenauer by emphasizing that how important it is to have this kind of discussions and platforms. We as Konrad Adenauer Foundation strongly believe that this kind of forums will offer a platform or a basis for possible political action. The Angola Forum, the Angola Economic Forum, has proven that to be a forum of dialogue between politics, economics, and civil society. In Germany, as well as abroad, Konrad Adenauer Foundation encourage international dialogue and the strengthening in the international relationship by promoting freedom, liberty, peace, and justice. Once again, thank you very much to you, to the audience, to Chatham House, and everyone who took part in the organizing of this event. But this is not the final concluding remarks. The final concluding remarks will be given by Mr. Dr. Alex Fines. I would like to hand over to Dr. Alex Fine. Alex.
Thank you very much, Natalie, for chairing that session so expertly. And I know that you're going to have a lot more to do with Angola because that's your new job, being director of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung office in Namibia, but also responsible for Angola. So I just want to thank, first of all, thank Giza Gaspi Martins, Vladimir Russo, Alan Kane, and Pedro Martins Barata. All of you, thank you for presenting and really providing a fascinating discussion on the green growth and building back better in Angola. This is the future. And we heard today just how important Angola is, not just for Africa, but for the world. The second most biodiverse country in Africa after South Africa. The amount of research that needs to be done, the lack of reliable data, but yet the importance of international partnerships in building back better science. All of these things came out today, and it left me really pleased that we had made this a priority for the Angola Forum 2020. I don't want to say anything more. The meeting was fully on the record. There is recordings of it. And Konrad Adenauer Stiftung and ourselves are going to produce a report, which we will make sure all participants those who registered have access to. That will be ready next year. As you all know, we had some 500 registrations globally. They included international oil companies, ratings agencies, governments, development workers, civil society, political parties and others. So it's a broad group of people interested in Angola. And that also was a pleasant surprise to me in the midst of this COVID crisis, that we can attract such a global audience on Facebook Live and Zoom. It just goes to show some of the silver linings of this pandemic, that actually in some ways it's been easier to bring people together than when we physically held Angola Forum meetings at Chatham House, and at the best we might have used Skype. So thank you everybody, boa tarde, e até a próxima. Hopefully we will have Angola 2021 and we will see you all again then. Obrigadíssimo a todos. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Obrigado.
Thank you.